The Michigan State Spartans are traveling on the road to SECU Stadium to kick off Big Ten Conference play against the Maryland Terrapins. That's right. Maryland versus Michigan State is the Big Ten Conference opener for the 2024 college football season. Maryland is laying 8.5 points. They are favored by just over a touchdown to beat the Michigan State Spartans. And their week one results, in a sense, couldn't have been any more different. Michigan State was sluggish against Florida Atlantic, while Maryland was magical against UConn. Maryland, I know they just played UConn, but they scored 40 points. They were winning 23-0 at the half, and they scored 27 points because Jack House missed an extra point in the second half. Their leading receiver was Ty Felton, who had nearly 200 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Billy Edwards threw for over 10 yards per pass attempt and had 2 touchdowns. And Maryland put up over 600 total yards in their win over UConn, who only scored 7 points. Maryland had nearly 30 first downs, and they earned 34 minutes and 21 seconds of possession as well. Michigan State played a Florida Atlantic team that is probably more talented and better overall than UConn. UConn is one of the hardest jobs in all of college football, not because the expectations are high, and in fact they're rather quite low, but because you're trying to coach a college football team at the Football Bowl subdivision level, occasionally playing some Power 4 teams, formerly Power 5, rest in peace to the Pac-12, but also a lot of Group of 5 teams who have better access to talent because, well, you're in Connecticut. You're not in the South. You're not in the West Coast. You're not in the Mountain Time Zone. You're not like Boise State, for example. You're UConn. And UConn, before Jim Mora got there, was wrecked by Randy Edsall. And Mora has had a hard time rebuilding that program. So case in point, Maryland did beat a team that was not as impressive as the team the Spartans beat. However, Michigan State failed to score a single point in the second half. They escaped Florida Atlantic instead of pulling away from Florida Atlantic. All 16 of their points, a safety and 2 touchdowns. One of those touchdowns being off of a turnover, just an 18-yard drive. The other being a one-play 63-yard K'Ron Lynch-Adams run. Those were all scored in the first half. And Michigan State's offense was consistently inconsistent. They were consistently bad. There was constant miscommunication. There were 3 turnovers. Michigan State had 15 first downs to Florida Atlantic's 19. And Michigan State only had 30 minutes and 41 seconds of possession, 293 total yards. Childs was 10 of 24 for 114 yards and 2 interceptions. Aiden Childs, who I thought entering this season would be a quarterback that resided in the top third of Big Ten quarterbacks, if not the top 4th, top 5th. In fact, I predicted him to be the 4th best quarterback in the Big Ten. His QBR was 30.7. He had a worse game than Michigan's Davis Warren, to put it in terms that Michigan State fans will understand. It was bad. Averaged 4.8 yards per pass attempt. MSU averaged 4.8 yards per carry on the ground. So Michigan State gained the same amount of yards per run play as they did per pass attempt, which is either indicative that your passing game sucks, more likely, or in very rare instances, it's indicative that your rushing performance is insane on that day or your running offense overall is elite. Like, I'm pretty sure from a Michigan fan standpoint, Michigan probably averaged more yards per carry against Penn State in 2022 than they did yards per pass attempt, and maybe some other games in that season and the season prior. And I think also against Washington in 2023 in the national title, Michigan may have averaged more yards per carry than yards per pass attempt. But that's very rare, and typically when it happens, when those numbers are close or when the yards per carry is greater, that's indicative that your passing offense has some serious issues. And that's what happened here. Michigan State was carried literally by K'Ron Lynch-Adams, who had 9 carries for 101 yards and a touchdown. Nate Carter had 19 carries for 48 yards with a long of 12. He struggled a bit. Aiden Childs, he managed to run for almost 30 yards, and he had a rushing touchdown. Just overall, it was a strong effort defensively from the Spartans, who had 10 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 2 interceptions, but their offense couldn't do anything with it. And now they go on the road against a Maryland team who, again, 50-7 against UConn. They game controlled the Huskies to death. Per efficiency, they had the second best performance in week 1 out of all Big Ten teams, I do believe. I'm going to double check that really quickly. And Maryland's defense holding UConn to 7 points. They held them to 2.9 yards per carry, 6.7 yards per pass attempt. They didn't have a sack, and they only had 1 TFL, but Maryland has historically been a team that's better at pass defense and has more NFL players in their secondary than on their defensive front. We'll see if that continues here in this game, where it's going to be Big Ten on Big Ten, not Big Ten on Group of 5. And I'm very curious to see how this all plays out. I do think it will be a close game, that's for sure. Maryland, yes, they actually had just slightly a more efficient performance than USC did in week 1. That's the only reason I wanted to check. But yeah, per ESPN's efficiency ratings, the top 6 most impressive performances, so the performances that were in the top third of all 18 Big Ten team games in week 1, were Penn State at 1, Maryland at 2, USC 3, Purdue 4. Michigan was actually there at 5, but I think that's just because Fresno State's a really good Group of 5 team, and Ohio State was right there at 6th, despite their struggles against Akron in the first half. So Maryland played ridiculously well. Michigan State was all the way down there in terms of efficiency. They were, I think, 12th. Yeah, they were 12th. And against an FAU team that really has Deacon Hill passing ability at quarterback, except he just has legs. So let's move on and get into week 2, really, and talk about these offenses. Michigan State, I have to tell you, from their week 1 performance and also from their preseason profile, I thought that Maryland would be better at wide receiver, maybe about the same at running back, and that would be about it. But the disparity in these two offenses for week 1 is so massive that I don't know if this is an overreaction, but I don't think it is. I'm changing my tune on these offenses. There was just, with Michigan State, so much miscommunication, so much just plain ineptitude, and it really bothered me, if I'm being honest. And again, Maryland's a big game for Michigan State, so they were probably holding some things back for Maryland in the same way that I think like Texas and Michigan held things back for each other. I think Wisconsin is holding a little bit back from Alabama. And coaching staffs will do this early. You don't want to show your hand. But much like Michigan with their passing offense, and it's like, okay, Davis Warren's not a good quarterback. And if he looks that way on Saturday, that probably says a little bit more about Texas than it does about Michigan. For Michigan State here, I have a lot more faith in Childs than I do Warren, because I've seen Childs do awesome things at Oregon State. He was highly recruited out of high school, and he's in a new system, really, because while it's still Jonathan Smith and Brian Lindgren developing everything, he's with Michigan State now, not Oregon State, and there's a rebuild ahead for the Spartans. So I do think Michigan State's offense will perform better against Maryland than they did against Florida Atlantic, but still struggling to run the ball outside of really that K'Ron Lynch-Adams run, at least in a way that was a consistent threat. And Aiden Childs just not looking that good. Like, Michigan State's rushing offense looked average, above average, maybe good at the best, but Aiden Childs looked bad, to be honest. And Jack Velling, the leading tight end for the team, only had 1 reception for 15 yards. There was just constant miscommunication on the offense, particularly between the quarterbacks and the wide receivers. Michigan State as a whole team, though a lot of this was defensively, they had 12 penalties for 140 yards, which is why Florida Atlantic was able to be within striking distance constantly, and also why they were able to score 10 points and not be held to 3 or not be shut out, which is a testament in part to Michigan State's defense when they play disciplined, is I think that's a really good unit. But I think that's the same with Maryland's offense. I think Maryland's offense here, if Billy Edwards is the quarterback that he looked like against UConn, and he can put up not the exact same numbers, because 11.5 yards per attempt is not going to happen in Big Ten play, but if he can hit, 7, 8 yards per attempt, if he can put up Taulia Tagovailoa numbers, and the game against UConn suggests he may be able to do that, then Maryland can have a successful offense along with a defense that year over year has improved under Mike Locksley and his staff. Billy Edwards Jr. is top 25 in QBR right now. Again, he went 20 of 27 for 311 yards, 2 touchdowns. He also on the ground had 39 yards rushing, averaged 7.8 yards per carry. UConn had 8 TFLs and a sack, and Maryland still averaged 5 yards per carry on the ground with 3 rushing touchdowns along a 48. They had 248 rushing yards. Now, UConn didn't do themselves any favor by giving up 3 turnovers, and UConn just does not look like a great football team. They also went 0 of 1 on 4th down, so they gave Maryland the ball back 4 times in a non-punting situation where they didn't really flip the field in any beneficial way. I think right now Maryland is clearly better at quarterback based off of week 1. I think Childs is more talented than Edwards, but Edwards has a big frame. They used him a lot in quarterback sneak situations last year, and he had some playing time in 2022 when Taulia Tagovailoa was hurt, and he looked serviceable in those games. Receiver, I would have said in the preseason, is favoring Maryland than Michigan State. Michigan State has Monterey Foster Jr., they have Alante Brown, Nick Marsh. Nick Marsh is a true freshman, or I think true freshman, maybe. Yeah, true freshman. I thought possibly redshirt freshman, but I'm pretty sure he's just a true freshman. And then Maryland, they have Ty Felton. They also brought back Caden Prather. They have Octavian Smith and Braden Wislowski, was a pretty good returner last year. So they have more experience. They have more upside. Maryland's done a very good job under Mike Locksley and now Josh Gaddis and Kevin Sumlin of producing effective passing offenses, not just because of the quarterback play, but also the receiver play. And tight end, too. We'll see who emerges at tight end, but right now I'd put Michigan State ahead with Velling. I think Maryland wins at receiver. On the offensive line, it's close. I considered putting Michigan State here because I really love Tanner Miller, their center, and also Luke Newman. But Maryland's offensive line stepped up. They only prevented, they only allowed a sack and 8 TFLs. Michigan State allowed a sack and 5 TFLs, and they didn't run the ball quite as efficiently. I don't know if I'm off on that read there, but I know that Michigan State does have work to do in the trenches. It certainly looked like that against Florida Atlantic. And with Maryland, it just seemed like run after run after run and pass after pass, they were just breaking that UConn defense. But watch out in the trenches, because part of me wonders that with the staff that Michigan State has and some of the players they have on the line, they could show up in the trenches this week against Maryland. And I do think they have the better overall trench play. Not by a huge margin, but their defensive line, I think, is way better than Maryland's defensive line. But offense overall does go to Maryland. Defense, as I said, or at least hinted to a few seconds ago, I think would go to Michigan State. The defensive line and linebacker core, certainly. Defensive back, just because of all the damage that Mel Tucker and Scotty Hazelton did, and the fact that Maryland has Dante Trader, and they have guys who went to the NFL like years ago. And by years ago, I mean like in the 2023 and 2024 NFL draft. Maryland has done a good job of developing their secondary, and I have actually been impressed with their defensive coordinator, who Mike Locksley shouted out at Big Ten Media Days, Brian Williams, and they hired Azar Abdul-Rahim this preseason to be the co-defensive coordinator and defensive backs coach. He held the same title at Boston College last season. And I've been impressed with their secondary, the fact that they've put guys into the NFL. Jalen Husky's another player to look out for there. Same with Glendon Miller, who got an interception this past weekend. And I like what they have compared to what Michigan State does. But I'll tell you what Michigan State has that I don't think Maryland does. They have a proven pass rush. They have Chris Bogle. They have Daquan Dose. They have Jordan Turner. They have Alex Van Summer. They have Ken Talley. They have Cal Halliday. They have a great front. Rossi at Minnesota was more so known for, honestly, his secondary players like Tyler Nubin, Jordan Howden, Justin Wally, some of his linebackers as well. But his defenses at Minnesota never really got pressure on the quarterback. Last year they did a better job, but everything else outside of getting to the quarterback was very much at an inferior place compared to the 2021 and 2022 defenses. After week one, a little bit of an overreaction, but as I always say, the overreactions are more fun than my personal opinion. It looks like it might be the reason his defenses at Minnesota never were able to consistently get to the quarterback is the fact that I don't think he had the players, because obviously Minnesota doesn't recruit well. They always recruit players who they think are diamonds in the rough. They rarely get 4 stars, 5 stars, any of the like there. But Michigan State has some more talented players than Minnesota does. And Chris Bogle's an example. Came in the portal, was a 4-star at Florida. He came on in the Florida Atlantic game. Alex Van Sumeren was a highly recruited player out of high school. And if he can stay healthy, he'll be good. And Jordan Turner, incoming transfer from Wisconsin, was productive at linebacker there. And there are other players too, like Maverick Hansen on the interior of the D-line, who's a good defensive tackle. If Michigan State didn't lose Derek Harmon and Simeon Barrow to Oregon and Miami respectively, you could be looking at this defensive front in a few weeks, and I held this opinion in the preseason before they transferred out, that if that defensive line and linebacker room could be utilized correctly, it could be one of the better defensive fronts in the Big Ten. Year one under a completely new regime with a new defensive coordinator. That's the talent that Mel Tucker and Scotty Hazelton left behind in that defensive front. It was good talent. They could just never utilize it properly. But I think Michigan State has the edge on defense. Maryland has the edge on offense. Michigan State, I would say, slight edge in the trenches. I think they have a pretty big edge on the defensive front, but then again, Maryland has a big edge in the defensive backfield. They have the more NFL-ready players, the more proven Big Ten players. They are going to be more disciplined. Maryland, this is perhaps a very underrated example. Maryland had 5 penalties for 45 yards. They did not average 10 yards per penalty. Michigan State, again, 12 penalties for 140 yards, more than 10 yards per penalty, and more than double the penalties of Maryland. And Michigan State was doing that at home. They're going to be on the road, and while Maryland does not have the biggest and best home field advantage, their stadium is not going to be empty this early in the year, and Locksley's built level upon level, brick by brick in Maryland to where there's actually excitement and optimism surrounding the program. I say that when I predicted them to go 5-7 this season, but I didn't know how MJ Morris or Billy Edwards would turn out. And when it looked like MJ Morris was the starter based off of his time at NC State, where he just frankly wasn't that good, I didn't think that would translate to much, as with Maryland, you have to have good QB play. That's how everything's built. Locksley is an offensive coach, and while I have been impressed with the job that Brian Williams has done as defensive coordinator, I don't think Maryland has or at least had, we'll see what they do this year, the assistant coaches and the talent and the prioritization on the defensive side of the ball to let their defense win them games. Again, we'll see if that remains to be the case this season or not. But Billy Edwards Jr. looked very good against UConn. And yes, it's UConn. But They have enough talent, the Terps do, at wide receiver and running back to where if their O-line plays at a decent, respectable level and quarterback is above average or good, to where their offense will be one of the better offenses out of the old 14 Big Ten teams. Of course, with Oregon and USC and maybe Washington, they looked efficient at times against Weber State. With the new former Pac-12 teams coming in, the Big Ten is going to get more offensive juice. But Maryland, before they joined, in the old 14-team Big Ten, was consistently at the top of the Big Ten in terms of offense. It was defense and I would say at times game management or just a lack of talent or development that kept him back. But this game, I think, will come down to who's the more disciplined team. It'll come down to razor-thin margins. It will come down to who has a more cohesive team, because neither unit, I think, has this massive advantage over the other in terms of trench play, defense, and rushing offense, which typically determine outcomes in the Big Ten. Maryland, I think, has a slight advantage at running the ball at this point based off of what I saw. And I think Michigan State is slightly better in the trenches and respectively better on defense. But I think Maryland is more of a team. Maryland is a unit. They didn't use that many transfers because they were confident in what they returned, specifically on defense, but they returned some guys at wide receiver, and they also brought back running back Roman Hemby, and Billy Edwards has been with the program for years now. Michigan State brought in over 50 new players, I think like 60 or 61 new players, and you saw that with the miscommunication, with all the penalties, and the miscommunication points to the staff and the fact that Jonathan Smith is installing a very complex offense. And the defense points to the fact that chemistry and discipline haven't quite been built to their peak yet. All that being said, Maryland at home makes this game and matchup, I think, much different than if it was in Spartan Stadium. I would actually pick Michigan State to win this if it was in Spartan Stadium, because I do think Michigan State is holding some things back for this game in the same way that I think Maryland was probably holding a little bit back for this matchup as well. It is a conference matchup as well, counts toward conference standings, and without divisions, teams like Michigan State and especially Maryland, since they only have to play Rutgers every year, otherwise their schedule's a little bit flexible, they want to get every win they can, because their opportunity to win 6 or dare I say 7 conference games is higher now more than it ever would have been if they were just stuck in the Big Ten East. So all of these games, even if you think this is irrelevant, and you shouldn't, you'd be very foolish to think this game doesn't mean anything, this means a lot, exponentially more than maybe any of us could process to these two teams. I think Maryland being at home, having the more dynamic team, they're better in backfield play. They're way better in backfield play, way better at receiver, significantly better at DB. So far, they've impressed more at quarterback. And Michigan State doesn't have enough of an edge in the trenches or in the rushing offense to compensate for Maryland's edge on the outside in perimeter play and in the backfield. Maryland at this point is, again, they're more of a team. It'll take some time for Michigan State to be that team who can go on the road and win in scrappy fashion with what they have assembled right now. Again, if Michigan State was at home, I'd probably pick the Spartans by a field goal. Special teams, I would favor Michigan State in as well, and I'd favor them on defense. But Maryland, from what I watched and what I studied and saw, right now has an offense that could hit the ground running and could be on fire for 4 quarters. Michigan State's offense wasn't on fire at all outside of that 63-yard run by K'Ron Lynch-Adams. So I think Maryland covers. I think they win 27-17. Maryland, again, is favored by 8.5 points. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this game down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Brasco Rascal for being Heisman members and sponsoring this video and channel. If you want to check out my Patreon page, visit the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Thanks to Chris Lane, Connor Little, OH, Ismar, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. Thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being All-Conference members. If you want to purchase merchandise, you can also visit a link in the description down below in the pinned comment where it will say merchandise store. You can also, if you're a Heisman member for 6 months, you can get free signed College Football with Sam merchandise delivered to your doorstep. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all very soon. Bye-bye.